The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
This is a story told by Krishnamurti, who's an Indian sage. Once Satan and his demon sidekick were walking down the street, closely watching a man 20 yards ahead who was on the verge of realizing supreme truth. The demon grew worried and began to nudge Satan, but Satan looked quite calm. Sure enough, the man did, in fact, soon realize the deepest spiritual truth. Yet Satan did nothing about it. With this, the demon nudged Satan harder, and getting no response, he finally blurted out, "Satan, don't you see? That man has realized the truth, and yet you are doing nothing to stop him." With that, Satan cunningly smiled and announced, "Yes, he has realized the truth. And now I'm going to help him organize the truth." So many teachings and so many highest paths and so little time to check them all out. It's quite stunning in the spiritual marketplace now. You know, how many trainings and disciplines and this and that and the best and the highest. It can be quite overwhelming. It's really more exhausting than anything. And for many years, I was engaged into what some people call the highest path or the direct path. And I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about devotion in spiritual practice. So there are 4 questions I'd like to cover in the little time I have. The first is, why is devotion important, and how can you tap into it? The second is, what were the Buddha's teachings about devotion? And what are the shadow sides of devotion? What are the pitfalls? Every practice has something called the near enemies. They look like it, but they're not quite it. And then finally, how do you develop devotion when you're not wired that way? What I find so interesting, again, in the spiritual marketplace, is different traditions who will say this is the direct path. One tradition will say, well, the direct path is selfless service. Purify your actions, get the self out of service, and you will make a difference in people's lives, and you will transform your consciousness. That's the path of karma yoga. Lose the self in serving others. Another direct path is the path of self-discipline. Know what you want, give yourself to it fully, and purify the body, mind, and emotions as you move toward that goal. Another direct path is cultivating the path of self-knowledge. Learn to discern from what is real and what is not real. And that's a very, very powerful path. What is real, what is not real? It's more of an intellectual path. For some people, they're very, very, very turned on by that path. And another direct path is the path of devotion. Merge with the source of your devotion. We all have a different relationship with devotion. For some, it's very hard to access devotion. It certainly was for me. But an interesting way to reflect on devotion, because I think for many of us in the West, like devotion, that's like, there's sort of an allergy to it because it sort of implies sort of a mindlessness, like losing yourself in kind of a blind faith process. But I would guess most of us at some point have experienced some form of devotion. Not all of us, but some of us. So a short reflection, if you will. if you close your eyes for a moment, and just the sense, was anyone at any time in your life devoted to you? And probably early on, before you had words, when you were a baby, and again, not for all of us, but for some of us, that there was someone or some people who were devoted to keeping you safe, devoted to keeping you fed, devoted to keeping you clean. And can you just sense for a moment receiving that quality of attention? So if you like, you can again deepen your breath and let your eyes open. Again, not all of us have experienced that kind of devotion, but there's something about the purity of that connection that you may have felt in your life. So how do you use that kind of connection for spiritual leverage? Sri Nisargadatta, who's kind of a non-dual teacher, quite a powerful teacher, was really kind of nobody special, as he would describe himself. He sold bidis, he sold cigarettes for a living. And he thought he would check out this spiritual teacher and find out what everyone was talking about. And he had a profound connection with that teacher. And here's what he said about his awakening in his practice. When I first met my guru, he told me, "You are not what you take yourself to be. Find out who you are. Watch the sense, I am. Find your real self." I obeyed him because I trusted him. I did as he told me. I simply followed his instructions, which was the focus of the mind on pure being, I am, and stay with it. I used to sit for all hours together with nothing but the I am in my mind, and soon peace and joy and a deep, all-embracing love became my normal state. In it, all disappeared. Myself, my guru, the life I lived, the world around me. Only peace remained and unfathomable silence. So that key line, I trusted him. I did as he told me. There's something about that has a quality of kind of a chasm that we cross through trust and through love and through devotion. There's so many kind of mystical stories of transformation through this path of devotion. Surrendering yourself to a teacher, surrendering yourself to a lineage. But devotion also has a shadow side. And the Buddha knew of this, and he taught about this. There are a number of experiences that people have where in their struggle in life, they find themselves calling on something greater than themselves. And particularly if you go on a retreat, a classical retreat where you're in silence for many, many days. Quite often in that silence, what will arise is something that's between you and feeling free. And oftentimes it's something very painful that is coming to the surface to be seen and acknowledged and felt. Someone was telling me how on a retreat they were deeply, deeply caught in the recognition of an early childhood wound. Very hard to be with it. Lots of agitation and fear and restlessness. And then she remembered one of the classic teachings in this particular practice, but in the practice of Buddhism, which is recalling what are called the 3 refuges, the 3 places where you can go when you're lost. And they're referred to as the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And the Buddha references basically, for some people, it is the Buddha himself. For others, it's sort of the archetype of a human who became fully awakened. And for others, it can simply be wakefulness. The word Buddha means awake. That in any given moment of your deepest struggle, you can be awake. You can access non-judging awareness. It's possible. The Dharma can refer to the teachings, to the classical teachings of a particular lineage that resonates for some people. On the other end, it simply means truth. So you can access what is true in any given moment. Sangha means community or like-minded people. And for some, that can be the very specific community that you're affiliated with, that you draw on for support. And to the other extreme, it simply refers to love and kindness. And so, as she was in the midst of this deepest struggle, right in the core of it, there was something about that remembrance of the 3 refuges, where she said, I can be awake. Right? In the midst of this, I can be awake. I can access non-judging awareness. In the midst of this, I want to know what is true. I want to get under my story and my interpretation and my embellishment. I want to know what is true. And that gave her courage. And she also found it very powerful to connect to the community with whom she was meditating. And part of the power of connecting with like-minded people, particularly when you're in pain, there's a particular phrase where you can remind yourself, other people feel this too. And she recognized that the pain that she was experiencing was not unique to her, but other people feel this too. It wasn't like lights filled the room and angels descended and she was liberated forever and ever. But there was a profound shift in being caught to finding a way to be with it, where she could continue to kind of unwind it. So in a sense, there's a quality of remembrance, there's a quality of devotion that can occur. And it can be tremendously helpful when you're caught. To remember you have the capacity to be awake in any given moment. You have the capacity to recognize what is true in any given moment. And you have the capacity to tap into love, into kindness and empathy. So there are a number of, for people who practice in this tradition, there are a number of things that are sort of symbolic that can be helpful, like remembering these 3 refuges. For others, the classic image is the lotus flower, that out of the mud rises the flower. Sort of that remembrance when you're caught. That image for some people can be a very powerful way of kind of coming home. For others, there's the image of the Dharma wheel. If you've seen in Tibetan tradition, the spinning of the Dharma wheel. The recognition there's this cycle of life that we are constantly caught in. And that cycle is driven by desire. And when you can begin to observe and release your desires, you are less caught on this wheel of life. And that can be a very powerful remembrance as well. For some people, the image of the Bodhi tree, which is where the Buddha gained his enlightenment, can be a very powerful kind of devotional remembrance as well. It is possible to be awake. It has been done before. Others have come before me. But the Buddha in his time was very aware of not creating a personality cult. And he actively directed people away from focusing on him. But he did speak to the power of tuning in to people who were accomplished practitioners, kind of revering people who are kind of ahead of you on the path, those who've walked the path before. It can be a very powerful quality to tune in to those who you consider your heroes. Another meditation that's done in some traditions is to reflect on the qualities of an awakened being, to kind of reflect on the life of the Buddha, if you will, or what does it mean to be awake? What does it mean to be without desire? What does it mean to be free? In Theravadan Buddhism, kind of the orthodox form of Buddhism, the teacher is considered spiritual friend. There's not a hierarchy between the teacher and student, which is something I deeply, if there's anything, that's something I'm devoted to. But in other traditions, there are lineage traditions, such as the Tibetan tradition. It's a lineage tradition, so devotion to the teacher is part of the practice. That you're tuning in to your teacher who got it through his teacher, who got it through his teacher, so on and so on and so on. And that can be a very powerful form of practice. In those two different traditions, in the lineage tradition, the advantage of that, you could say, is that hopefully no one is installed as a teacher unless they've passed quality control. So you should be able to trust. On the other hand, it's sort of a power over other tradition, which can be disempowering. In its worst case, it can be kind of infantilizing. So you'll find in the Buddhist tradition, some traditions they're relatively narrow in their forms of devotion, and then others where devotion is a big part of the practice, where there are prostrations, the full body prostrations. In some traditions, that your practice doesn't start until you've done 10,000 prostrations. That's where you get on your knees, you lay out your whole body, and you do that 10,000 times as a way of surrendering the mind. There are certain practices of circumambulations, that are very devotional. So these expressions of devotion can be quite powerful. They have a bright side. They can really tune you into a purity of heart and a purity of sincerity, but they also have a shadow side. So here's a story which kind of relates. A lady went to see her priest one day and told him, "Father, I have a problem. I have 2 female parrots, but they only know how to say one thing." "Well, what do they say?" the priest inquired. "They say, 'Hi, we're hookers. Do you want to have some fun?'" "Isn't that awful?" the woman lamented. "That's obscene," the priest exclaimed. Then he thought for a moment, I may have a solution to your problem. I have 2 male parrots who talk, and I have taught them to pray and read the Bible. Bring your 2 parrots over to my house, and we'll put them in the cage with Francis and Job. My parrots can teach your female parrots to praise and worship God, and your parrots are sure to stop saying that indecent phrase." The woman said, "Thank you, that's a wonderful solution." The next day, the woman brought her female parrots to the priest's house. As he ushered the woman in, she saw that his 2 male parrots were there, Francis and Job. They were inside their cage, and they were holding rosary beads and actually praying. And their pious little faces were upturned toward heaven, with the beaks moving slightly as they prayed intently to the Lord. Very impressed, the woman walked over and placed her parrots inside the cage with these two very devout parrots. After a few minutes, sure enough, the female parrots cried out in unison, "Hi, we're hookers. Do you want to have some fun?" A long moment of silence ensued. Shocked, one male parrot looked over at the other male parrot and said, "Put the beads away, Frank. Our prayers have been answered." So what's the shadow side of devotion? So I'd like to share a little bit about my experience and sort of my struggles with devotion. As I've mentioned many, many times, way back when I stumbled into an ashram, and when I first arrived, it was just a really vibrant place, really wonderful people, and I was asked, are you coming to meditation tonight? I thought, wonderful. Yeah, sure, I love meditation. So when I walked into this meditation hall, there were a few hundred people there, and there was this teacher up front with kind of long hair and wearing a robe, and he started playing the harmonium and chanting, and then at some point, the chanting changed, and then I noticed people started kind of weeping, and then then there were times when he'd stop and he would just let out this cry, and then the shockwave would go through the room, and people would start crying and shaking and having all kinds of cathartic experiences. I was in the very back of the room, and it was shocking to me, because I thought, man, these people are so nice during the day. Well, what is going on? The next morning, there was meditation again. And as I was really tuning into the energy, again, this chanting, and then this pause, and then this sort of like this release from the teacher. And then I could feel like this shock wave go through the room. And then it just hit me. And I just had this sort of catapulted into a very, very profound and deep state of consciousness. And what I discovered later was that this teacher's teacher from India, who was a very, very profound teacher, had given him something called Shaktipat Diksha. And Shakti means energy. And Shaktipat Diksha is the capacity to awaken and move energy in other people. So at this particular time in the ashram, my teacher's teacher had just given him this capacity. And my teacher thought, well, I guess I just need to let it rip. So for about 4 months, in the morning and in the afternoon, it was like being microwaved, and it was and it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. There was nothing like it. But something happened over that period of time. Was that among this community of practitioners, and we were all practicing very, very diligently, it became clear that the source of this energy was him. And it became the whole community was very focused on him. So there's a lot of competition as to how to maneuver your way to get close to the source. And because I was so enamored by this, I maneuvered my way in there as well. So I did some writing with him, and I joined there was a massage team of brothers who worked in him. I did that for a while. And then later I traveled with him, sort of his warm-up act when he would go on the road. Did that for a number of years. And it was an interesting process because this was kind of a classical ashram, and it embraced a lot of the devotional practices. So we did pranams all the time, which is basically bowing, where you're placing your head beneath your heart. We did pujas every night, and a puja is a very powerful, like a festival of light, kind of honoring of light. So every night the community would gather, and there would be the lighting of incense, and it was a very beautiful experience. But it was very, very focused on the guru and on the teacher. And in that, there was something that I began to notice, and that is that because it was such a heart space, there was kind of an anti-intellectual quality to the community. And there was this attribution of everything was coming from the teacher. The joke in ashrams is that when you get diarrhea, it's the guru's grace. And when it clears up, that's the guru's grace. Everything is attributed to the teacher. And to his credit, he saw this happening, and he dialed it back some. But there was something very, very profound here in play. And that was a sense of kind of getting the power of surrender, but also at the same time a condition which occurred in many, many ashrams that made it tremendously ripe for abuse. And as it turned out, there was abuse. There was some sexual impropriety, there was some monetary issues that arose, this was back in the early 90s. And you may recall all the ashrams fell. Basically, all the ashrams fell. As Ram Dass said, the Westerners went east to get enlightened, and the Eastern teachers came west and got horny. So there was kind of a cover-up. At some point he was asked to leave, and then many of us stayed on to try and reinvent the community to be more ecumenical and non-sectarian. But it was very interesting. It was in 1994 when our community completely crashed. Everything crashed. But I like to think at that time, you may recall, again, all the big ashrams fell, but also in churches and synagogues and schools, there was this outing of power over other. And I like to think that our consciousness was evolving, that it just couldn't tolerate that anymore. And now, of course, we're seeing that again with the Me Too movement, that I like to think that there's something in our consciousness that can no longer tolerate that kind of abuse. So I would imagine that most of us here have put our faith in another person and been betrayed at some point. And as hard as that is, as I like to say, that the flip side of betrayal is you get your life back. And that old model fell, and as a community of 300 people, we had to move on. And most of us did. Some people stayed very kind of stuck, kind of in that trauma. So while there can be an exquisite beauty in devotion, there is a real shadow side of blind devotion or blind faith. Do you remember the tech bubble, back in the 90s? A friend convinced me this was the moment when I could make my life easy by investing in tech. So we jumped on board with the number one tech advisor at that time. I won't say his name, but it rhymes with Schmeichel Schmurphy. If you, he's still out there. And I decided if he tells me to wear red underwear, I'm going to wear red underwear. And so I did everything like he's the best. And I put everything into this guy. And I lost everything. So the antidote to blind faith is wise discernment. And it becomes a very, very interesting balance in your life. How do you keep your heart open? And at the same time, how do you cultivate clear seeing? And this is for me, the real beauty of the Buddha's teachings, where the Buddha would repeatedly say, when he would point something out, he would say, don't believe what I'm telling you. Verify this for yourself and see if it's true. And that, to me, that's just pure, and that is really clean. So, being aware of blind faith can be very, very helpful. Also, another is to be aware of how you use devotion in a way that can be self-aggrandizing. You know, when you pray for something that you're going to be able to do to enhance your ego, there's a shadow side there as well. Devotion with an expectation of a return. Again, when you are giving to other people, are you expecting something back? Or is that giving really pure? You know, after all I've done for you, you would do this to me? Well, that form of giving may not be as clean as it could be. So I think that the ultimate prayer, if you will, is really just two words. It's thank you. It's about receiving the moment. As someone said, the quickest way to be happy is to choose what you already have. And there's a tremendous power in receiving what is here. That opens a profound door. So in this practice, you are cultivating the intellect or wisdom. You're cultivating your capacity to burn through your stories and identify what is true, to really see into the nature of reality. But you're also cultivating your heart. And so the question becomes, how do you cultivate the heart in this practice? In the ashram where I lived, it was like over-the-top devotional. And it was like, this is the direct path. So there were images of the guru everywhere, of his teacher and his teacher's teacher. When he wasn't meditating there'd be a big photo of him in his chair, kind of as a reminder. We would do pranams all the time. We would do pujas all the time. And it didn't come naturally to me. I really kind of had to force myself to do it. And I was very influenced by a Japanese monk who wrote, he said, I bow because I hate it. That he did it as a discipline, as a way of really humbling himself. So I really gave myself to that, and yet I saw around me what I perceived as the encouragement of kind of a naive, magical thinking. And I heard a very, very profound little teaching that really shifted things for me. Because I judged myself for not being more naturally devotional to the teacher and the lineage and the path and the bells and the smells and all of that. And I heard this phrase that said that some people are naturally inclined to devotion to the form, and some people are more naturally inclined toward devotion to the formless. And I realized, that makes sense for me. I am not someone who's naturally devoted to a teacher, a path, a lineage, but I am utterly devoted to waking up. I am utterly devoted to being of service, to giving all I can give in this life. So the question becomes, well, what is it that you are most devoted to? As I'm reflecting on this, as I sense into it, I know that I am devoted to waking up as much as I can in this life. I'm devoted to this idea of selfless service, to be a giver and not a taker, to being as awake and vibrant as I can be in my life. That lights me up. So a little reflection, if you like. So as you close your eyes, so the inquiry here is, in your life, what is it that you are most devoted to? A good way to reflect is those in your inner circle, in your family, or your pets, if you have children or grandchildren. Just the sense, the level of connection or devotion you may feel toward their well-being. And what qualities of being are you most devoted to in your life? And as you reflect on this, can you locate what that feels like on the inside? Could you amplify that? Could you let that get big? And you may sense here a quality of sincerity, a quality of purity, a quality of aliveness. And is there a sense of how this inner quality of devotion might inform you in your practice in some way? So you can gently deepen your breath, and you can let your eyes open. Your experience of devotion is unique. Finding your own wiring is so important. But when you can figure out that wiring and call on it, it can be a very powerful force. Devotion is not just a way of focusing your mind, but it's a way of focusing your heart and your whole body. It's about giving yourself fully, without reservation, to what calls you in your life. So I'll close with a little story. It's a story we used to tell back in the ashram days. It's a story of a very poor man who lived in the woods, and he worked as a woodcutter. And he desperately wanted to study with this renowned teacher. And so he went to ask if he could be his student, and he was refused for whatever reason. And he was told to go back into the woods and just live his life. And the story goes that years later, that this teacher was traveling through those woods. And he and his entourage came upon this crude statue that kind of looked like him. And it was created by this woodcutter. And he walked into the clearing and he had this shining, beautiful countenance about him. And this teacher remarked that it doesn't matter what you're devoted to, but the purity of your devotion can transform your life. So as you reflect on what most enlivens you, what's most important in your life, when you amplify that and let that in, let it be part of your path, it can help to shine a light, to focus your heart and to focus your mind. So a short meditation before we close. One beautiful form of devotion is the offering of merit. And we'll close with a brief reflection. And you may reflect on this day and this evening. All of your activities, all of your effort that you've poured into this day. And you might imagine that whatever merit, whatever benefit you have cultivated today, offer it freely and generously to yourself. Imagine your path filled with ease, filled with well-being. And then in your own way, offer that well-being to those in your very inner circle. Imagine these beings benefiting. Let that circle widen to include those you live with, those you work with. And let that radiate out to all beings in all directions without discrimination. May the fruit of your effort be of benefit to all. And as you offer it outward, sense of you can simultaneously offer it inward to this breath and every cell of your body. When you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Really good to see you and to be with you. If you have questions about the day long that we're leading or about breath, Larissa, if you want to hang out here, that would be terrific. Ray, you're leading the mindful discussion group afterward. No tea and cookies tonight and for the next week or two, I believe. Thank you for your support for the class. Feel free to sign up in for the newsletter and so forth in the back.